And I think it's kind of something to keep in mind, you know, as we go on. This this administration has an extremely daunting set of challenges, and just very quickly, if you look at the kind of constraints, you think you're the President of the United States, you walk in office, you can do whatever you want, but the kind of considerations, the kind of constraints that the Obama administration has to do with, first, resources, massive deficits, the most severe recession in the last 50 years, tremendous competition for funding, be it healthcare, be it the environment, be it getting out of the recession. The American people have very short attention spans. I remember I once worked for a guy about 25 years ago. We were in the middle of the Lebanon crisis in the early 80s. This guy told me, he said, you know, one thing you've got to understand, Tom, U.S. foreign policy is a mile wide and an inch deep. And it's something to really keep in mind. We're very wide, we're not too deep. We're particularly not too good with attention spans when there's wars involved. This president has opposition all over the place. We expect it from the right. He's also getting it from the left, and you can see right now, in fact, your senior senator from Michigan has started in a very key position, has started calling into question, he and others, you know, are involved in Afghanistan. You know, should we, is there an answer? Even the core constituency of the kind of Save Darfur crowd is going after the president and his special envoy now, because the special envoy is trying to call attention to the tremendous potential for conflict or renewed conflict between the North and the South in Sudan, and not, according to some, paying enough attention to Darfur. This president came into office and said, I'm going to consult, I'm going to listen, I'm going to take more of a multilateral approach. And that's great, sounds good, but when you say it, you better do it. And sometimes your friends are not going to tell you what you want to hear. And so there's a bit of a constraint there. And it's particularly when you're dealing with the UN. The UN takes on some of the toughest challenges. They do peacekeeping where no one else wants to do it, in Darfur, in Haiti, in the DRC, the Congo. They take on poverty issues when, you know, they're beyond the scope of any individual country. Another element to consider is Americans like their leaders to be decisive. They like them to make decisions. Letting things take their course, letting things develop is not something that we're particularly comfortable with. And when you think about North Korea or Iran, sometimes the best thing, you know, take the recent, you know, election in Iran. And it would have been so easy for us to be right in the middle, saying this is terrible, this is terrible, this is terrible. And we become the great safety kit. And so sometimes there's a real temptation to be aggressive, forceful, decisive, proactive, when the best thing might be is to let the situation develop. Now, I want to kind of just go and lay out what the agenda is. And when one looks at all of this together, it gets really, really challenging. First of all, this president probably spends less than 25% of his time on foreign policy, given the other challenges out there. And when you stop and think about that, this is quite a load. At the top of the list have to be the wars: Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Iraq, obviously. There's a friend of mine who wrote a book not too long ago, Richard Haas, he's the president of the Council of Foreign Relations, and he talked about wars of choice, wars of necessity. Have you read that book? And he was saying that Afghanistan was basically a war of necessity and Iraq was a war of choice. And I would posit there's probably three paradigms out there. There's wars of choice, perhaps Iraq, perhaps Vietnam. There's wars of necessity. I would say I was ambassador in Bosnia. I would say it was probably a war of necessity, even though some would probably argue with me on that. And then there's wars that are probably necessity, but we don't have good answers. And I think that's what Carl Levin was driving. And I think that's my perception of where Afghanistan is. There's always a perception that we got the answer. But the Brits didn't have the answer, and the Russians didn't have the answer, and I'm not sure we have the answer. And then you've got Iraq. And we'll leave Iraq hopefully soon. will not be a fully functioning democracy. And many hope it will be a state that's friendly with a state that's quite belligerent toward us, Iran. So it will be something less than we hope for. Those are the wars. Then you got the crises. You've got the Arab-Israeli crises, and I'd say ES, over many, many decades. The kinds of questions, when do we jump in? What do we do? What levers do we have on both sides? What do we do when they say no? And then how do we deal with them as they're trying to deal with their own difficult constituencies? And that's on both sides. Both the PLO and Hamas and Netanyahu, who was elected with his very, very complex, difficult coalition. You got North Korea, another crisis that pops up periodically. We know what the goal is. We're not quite sure if we're going to get there. We're dealing with a regime that we don't understand, that we don't have much experience with, that we see as pretty unpredictable, that wants recognition from us, that wants to deal directly with us, and we want to deal multilaterally. Then you got Sudan. I mentioned a brief reference to Sudan before. Sudan is not strategic. One could argue because of the oil it is, but I would argue no, it's much more humanitarian. But it really raises questions of how far we're willing to go in areas that are humanitarian in nature, not particularly strategic, and particularly in Africa. And I think the watershed there was Somalia. You know, we went into Bosnia about the same time, or shortly after. We didn't, you know, we've been through some terrible times in Somalia. We didn't go into Rwanda the next year. 800,000 people invested. And I think that this raises some serious questions about you know, the extent to which we are willing to act in humanitarian crises. Those are the crisis areas. Then we've got the serious issues that are always there. Terrorism. There's a real danger, according to some. I agree with this, that we might take our eye off the ball. And I'm not associating myself with Dick Cheney on the Sunday talk shows. I'm more concerned about the bombs we saw in Madrid at the train station in 2004 than I am about smuggling nuclear weapons into the United States. That is real. Another big area that we risk taking our eye off the ball is narcotics. It's now on our back door. You know, people say, oh, it's down a little bit in Afghanistan. It's the yield of crime. It's Mexico. Arms control. President Obama, again, I don't speak for the administration, he recognizes the seriousness of arms control. He's made this kind of centerpiece when he speaks to the UN in a couple of weeks of what he's going to try to focus on. This is very, very serious. There's a lot of work that needs to be done. Climate change, the silent tsunami, that every day we must do something, it gets worse. The jury is still out on what's going to happen in Copenhagen. There is a pressing need for U.S. leadership. It's not just speeches from the president, it's our Congress as well. You all know where things stand. The issue, set of issues that always gets shoved to the side when all of these other pressing issues, with the wars, with the crises, come to play as poverty. When Jack was introducing me, he didn't mention I had spent 4 years after I left the State Department as CEO of one of the world's largest NGOs that works on behalf of children around the world, an organization called Plan International. And I saw 66 countries in which we were working every day. Now that we've got a global economic crisis, the countries that have the ability to help are pleading poverty themselves. And a lot of people are suffering. The levels of people living in absolute poverty have been going down over the years. The Millennium Development Goals are not being met in 2015. AIDS gets a lot of money, could use more. Malaria, tuberculosis, and diarrhea kill many, many more people in Africa than AIDS. So that's the broad panoply. How am I doing on time? Okay. That's the broad panoply of what the agenda is and what the challenges are. I always get a lot more out of questions and answers, so I think we've got a few minutes, and I would be happy to take comments, questions, and answers, and I'll talk about anything but the issue on Saturday. Thank you. I think the easiest thing to do is just line up behind the microphone, so because we don't have much time.
The administration has had work so far. This is on?
Yeah.
Israel.
Can you all hear in the back? No, can't hear up here. Talk loud.
Yes, the administration has had no luck so far in getting Israel to discontinue building of settlements, much less enter into negotiations with the Palestinians on the initiative that the Arab states offered in 2005. What do you say? And experts have said that without external pressure, Israel simply will not move, particularly with Netanyahu and Lieberman in. And Lieberman has even insulted the president recently by saying if you can't get health care, what makes him think he can restart the peace process? My question to you is, do you see any value in the United States suspending its $3 million a year in military aid to Israel?
$3 billion.
What?
$3 billion.
$3 billion, I'm sorry. Yes, $3 billion, or even threatening to withdraw its guarantee of State of Israel bonds as a way of moving Israel, or do you think those things should be off the table?
Well, forget what I think. I happen to have been working on the issue both in 1981 after the Israelis bombed Tuatha, the Osiris reactor in Iraq, and President Reagan was beyond livid because he genuinely was surprised by this. And he ordered the suspension of a bunch of F-16s to Israel. That lasted 3 weeks. I also was director in the same office a decade later under President Bush Sr. When he froze the $10 billion loan guarantee for housing for Israel. And that lasted until the election started. So, I'm just telling you, the reality is, under any president, it's not sustainable. And, I would say don't cock the gun unless you aim to shoot it. And in those cases, they never aimed to shoot it. They never aimed to fire. There was no ammunition. So, is it off the table? That's up to the Obama administration. My historic observation is it's very, very hard to do. And don't make a threat unless you are absolutely sure you want to carry it out. My suspicion is with all of the other things on the table that the Obama administration has, it's not a realistic option. You and I can debate whether it's morally correct or whatever. That's something else. And the reality is you have to deal with the government in place in Israel. And Netanyahu put together a coalition. I know he didn't get the most votes by a little bit, but he was the one who put together the coalition, and they got to deal with it. How they get there, we all know the end result that we'd like to see. And that was basically what was on the table at Camp David in 2000. How you get there is the trick. Please.
You seem rather categorical on the Millennium Goals and that they will not be met. What priority does the administration have on them, and what are the chances of some furthering of these goals? 10%, 20%, 30%?
Well, again, for the sake of brevity, I made a broad statement. In many countries, that's absolutely true. There are countries where some of these goals, and a couple of countries where all these goals will be met, but writ large, globally, they will fall far short, I believe, unless some miracle happens, and we're already halfway through, or 2/3 of the way through, they won't be met. The administration, and this is well beyond the United States. This is all of the countries who have the wherewithal. There's a qualitative and a quantitative aspect to this. The qualitative is money, and the quantitative, or I should say, the quantitative is money, and the qualitative is spending the money wisely. And increasingly, and this is from an NGO perspective, the guy who was on the ground, I think it's extremely important not to just be throwing a lot of money into these things, but to be building capacity. in these countries, because at the end of the day, it's about what you leave, not what you create. It's about not how many kids are in school, but it's how well children are learning. It's not about how many kids are getting inoculated, but it's what the state of their health is. And there's a tremendous difference between outputs and outcomes, and I don't think there's nearly enough focus on the outcomes. And I think that that's something that the NGO sector can do a lot more. But the fact of the matter is the money's it's not even close to being there to address these needs.
Yeah, just a quick follow-up. What's the priority in the NGO community on this issue?
As many NGOs have as many different priorities as you can imagine. There's 8 millennium development goals, and depending on what NGO is focusing on what they'll address. There's no such thing as an NGO community that speaks with one voice. The NGO community is kind of like the United Nations.
First of all, Mr. Miller, thank you for coming here to this Michigan. Having said that, I just have kind of a general question. What do you think will end up happening in Afghanistan once we've left there, which will hopefully be relatively soon? And what do you think? How do you think that we can, that the United States, especially, can help to rebuild that country?
Well, I'm sure glad you asked for a 30-second answer. Look, just a couple of things I'd like to say on that. The answer is I don't know any more than you guys. I mean, that's the honest answer. Those of us who lived through Vietnam, see striking parallels. I mean, it's eerie in some ways. And I'm not saying it's Vietnam, it's a lot of different circumstances. There was no 9/11. I don't think I want to equate the Gulf of Tonkin resolution with 9/11. My concerns are these, and they're really twofold. Obama comes in office and he says, I'm going to have very limited goals. I'm not going to be doing the whole panoply of nation building. And everyone says, yeah, that sounds about right. And the limited goal is make sure that this is not territory that can be any longer used by Al-Qaeda to attack Americans. Most people would agree with me. Well then, as they get into it, and Dick Holbrook was one of my mentors, and some of you I've been pretty close to over the years. And he's kind of taking the lead on this. As they get into it, they realize that you can't just do that limited stuff without doing the non-military, the development stuff. You just can't do it. You can't accomplish that limited goal of, you can't just use drones to take care of that concern. It's a lot more complicated than that. But that's not enough right there. We also come into conflict with American values. And this is really serious stuff. We're very proud of the fact that girls can go to school in Afghanistan again, at least in some areas of Afghanistan. And, that's a value. That's a value. But you don't get there unless you're doing all the development. And if you do all the development, you kind of get sucked in. I don't have an answer to how you get out of that vortex that you've been sucked into. All I'm saying is I've seen that movie before, and it's good. And I'm not sitting up here saying, hey, we got to get out of Afghanistan tomorrow. I'm just saying we got to be doing some very serious thinking, and make sure that we're doing constant course corrections and thinking about this, because it's such an easy way to get sucked in.
I would like to have you comment in regards to the Obama administration and Africa. You will remember that the Secretary of State has just come back from an extensive visit in Africa. Africa representing resources that the world needs. Sub-Saharan Africa with its refugees, Sub-Saharan Africa with its intense genocide.
I said a few things earlier about it. You know, administrations come in office. The Bush administration did the same thing. They came in and they said, we're going to really pay attention to Africa because our predecessors didn't. The Obama administration comes in and said, we're going to really pay attention to Africa because our predecessors didn't. And Hillary goes and does this week-long trip, et cetera. And the rhetoric is fine. I think there's a much more fundamental set of issues here, and that is, what kind of role can we really play beyond the rhetoric? And I think that's something that's still being, frankly, sorted out. Clearly, there's a development role, but the question is, what do you do in these kinds of situations, like you see in Darfur, like you see in the Congo, DRC, like you see in Zimbabwe, where you see terrible things happening, and you know you've got leaders who are really ready to write off their own people. In the UN a couple of years ago, they all got together and they passed a resolution called Right to Protect, R2P. And everyone thought, that's finally the answer. It gives you, in these terrible extremist situations, gives you the moral obligation to intervene. Well, it hasn't been implemented. It hasn't been used. You now have China. There's going, very, very heavily into Africa, very much on a commercial basis. Does deals with governments regardless of their political complexion, of their human rights record, what have you. They're in many countries the biggest player. And kind of the United States and the rest of the West is pretty much absent. And that's an answer that has to come up with, that we have to come up with. My concern is that we say the right things, but when it comes to putting real equities on the table, whether it's serious money or whether it's troops when necessary, we're very shy about it.
A nation which is 5 times the population of the United States, namely China, and a nation which is 4 times the population of the United States, namely India, now apparently have strong military forces on the southern border of China, near India, in several particular contingents, and there is the potential for military conflict. Have you had any exposure to that, and do you see that suddenly becoming a disastrous situation?
It's a serious issue. It's a serious area. There has been conflict between India and China over the years, not in recent years. Is it on my top 20 list of things that keep me awake at night? Probably not now. They've got such a common interest in making sure that it doesn't happen. And they have methods and mechanisms that they didn't have before for resolving disputes. Short of this, they also both have a very strong premium on kind of the sovereignty issue. As you don't mess in my area, I won't mess in your area. One that keeps me awake much more than India and China is India and Pakistan over Kashmir. Both are nuclear powers, of course China's nuclear power too. And that's one, particularly given the situation in Pakistan right now, that worries me a lot. Yes, ma'am.
In 1956, Israel took over the Sinai, and the United States succeeded to push them to give it back. Ben Gurion just gave it back. In 1967, Israel took over the Sinai, and they did give it back, but it was with agreement with Egypt, and it was with taking out settlements.
Right.
Why not now?
Why? I'm sorry.
Why can't the United States do it now?
Well, it's great. I don't work for the Obama administration, so I'll give you my 2 cents. Any agreement, doing Egypt and Israel compared to Israel and the Palestinians was cake. It was relatively easy. We didn't think so at the time. But doing Camp David and the disengagement of Sinai, there were a few settlements. There was a great deal of hostility, where you had Israeli troops going in, as you recall, and forcibly evicting settlers. They did it. But that was a couple of settlements. You know, the population in the West Bank has exploded. And I'm not gonna, I forget the numbers, but I want to say something like 300,000 or so. You know, when I was back in the 80s, it was like 60,000. The fact of the matter is that it's one of the questions that I ask is when do we bring our influence to bear, knowing that if we make a threat and either side says no, we're not going to do it, what's the next step? It's tough. It's very, very tough. And this is where nuanced diplomacy and what George Mitchell's trying to do, you know, was just do a bit of confidence building, a bunch of baby steps before we do the big giant step. In my experience over the last 25 years is giant steps don't work in the peace process. They're very appealing intellectually. People love to write about them, but they just plain and simple don't work. It's a bunch of baby steps. It's a bunch of confidence builders that might get you there.
Salam alaikum, peace be with you. I was born in Haifa, Palestine. I was one of the first refugees to leave Palestine. And since I've been in this country, I came here at the age of 12. I've been here 62 years. What I've learned most is that it's a double speak, and that it's Orwell's, we have to destroy the city to save it. It's the Machiavellian, might makes right. Aside from the Palestine issue, our sister from the native people spoke about the indigenous people. Palestinians are the indigenous people, but that's never really brought up. Israel has a free reign with American tax dollars to continue the slaughter in Palestine. It's unconscionable. But my question for you, as head of the UNA-USA, you have a great opportunity to get America more involved with the United Nations and to get the American people to be more clear about the need for true international justice. What plans do you have to inform the American people about this possibility?
It's a good question. First of all, I want to make it absolutely clear that my wonderful organization does not have the capability to do this single-handedly. There's a lot of organizations, there's a lot that needs to be done. There are tremendous misperceptions, misunderstandings in the American body politic about the UN and what the UN can and cannot do. One of the things that we try to focus on is education. You know, making sure you're entitled to whatever views you want, but don't be ignorant of the facts. Don't be ignorant of, you know, of the background. And then go in this country, as you just stated, your opinion on a number of very important issues. Those are your opinions. And thank God you're in a country where you can voice your opinions and not get tossed in jail. We try to do a lot with younger people. Many of you are familiar with Model UN. I know many of you are probably participating, but that's kind of our flagship product. We've branded it in something called Global Classrooms. We're very much focusing on, you know, not even high school, but high school most definitely, but we're even starting in junior high school and learning by doing. And I think there's a tremendous potential there with the younger generation. Frankly, I think my generation hasn't done too good a job. When you do the public opinion surveys and ask some very basic questions about the UN, you know, you just get ignorance. You guys see this in polling of the American population on other kind of outside the United States type of issues. The one that I always love is you go around, you ask people, just as an illustration, what do you think about the UN? And surprisingly, on the polling data, most people are fairly positively disposed. You know, unlike what you would think from our, you know, the actions of our legislature or our Congress. And then you go and you ask them, well, do you think we give too much money to the UN? And everyone, you know, 80% of people say yes. You don't ask them anything, you know. You say, hey, do you think we give too much money? Do you think the U.S. wastes money? And 80% of people say yes, 75, 80%. And then you ask them, well, what percent of our budget do you think we give to the UN? And they come up with some astronomical figure, 20 to 25 times what we give them, and then you tell them. If you were to understand, if you were to know that the amount that we give to UN and associated agencies, UNICEF, UNHCR, etc., was X, would that change your mind? And the numbers flip out. They go to 75 to 80%, saying, well, I think that's fine. We should probably do more. And there's a very similar question that's been asked in polling data, and David, I know you can remember this one, on U.S. foreign aid. Most people are dead set against U.S. foreign aid until you tell them how much it is. And you say, you say, well, why are you against it? Well, it's way too much. And you say, well, would it change your mind if I told you that it's less than 1% of our budget? You say, yeah, absolutely, the numbers flip-flop. And so there's a tremendous need for education. I have a great deal of regard for our system in this country. Let people make up their own minds. Just make sure they have the facts before they do it. And we have a lot of work to do in that area. The fact that we're a membership organization, we've got chapters all over the place, I think makes our job, something where we can really have some influence. But there's a lot of need